Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of our metadata basics training. We did part 1 back in October. If you missed it, the recording is available on YouTube, so please feel free to watch that. You do not need to have attended part 1 to understand what's happening here, but it is a good introduction to schemas and to like an introduction to metadata as a concept. Today's webinar is also being recorded and will be available after the session. We have also enabled live transcription. So if you would like to see captions, you can click on the closed caption button on the bottom of your Zoom window. If you do not want to see that, you can also turn that off there. Please be aware that the captions are automated, so there may be some errors in the transcription. And I'm Keila Zayas Ruiz. I'm the Sunshine State Digital Network Coordinator. And also presenting with me today is Xiying from the University of South Florida. And without further ado, I will let her get started. Oh, and if you have any questions during the session, please feel free to add those to the chat. We will answer those at the end, but so you don't forget your questions, you can enter those in the chat at any time. And without further ado, I will pass it along to Xiying.
Thank you, Keila. Good morning, everyone. So in this session, I'm going to talk about controlled vocabularies. Patricia Halperin defined the controlled vocabularies as organized set of organized arrangement of words and phrases used to index content and or to retrieve content through browsing or searching. In other words, a controlled vocabulary is predefined and it's standardized. Its purpose is to facilitate indexing and searching. Next slide, please. Thank you. I think I'm going to first introduce different types of controlled vocabularies and their structures, and then I will explain how controlled vocabularies facilitate indexing and searching. There are a few different types of controlled vocabularies. Today, we're going to cover term list, authority files, taxonomy, and the theory. A term list is the simplest kind of controlled vocabulary. It's often a flat list of predefined and agreed terms. It's usually best for a smaller amount of terms, such as the DCMI type vocabulary, which has only 12 terms. This kind of controlled vocabulary can be used to filter search results on the user's end. The second type of controlled vocabularies is authority files. Authority files are more complex than the term list. They provide a consistent list of terms to describe different kinds of resources and also include cross-references from variant or alternate terms. They often include other contextual or biographical information to assist users with disambiguation. On the screen is an example from the Library of Congress authority files. Notice in the 1XX field, in our case is 110. In this field is the authorized term. In the 4XX and 5XX fields, there are all the variant terms for the authorized term. And in the 650 field, there is a contextual background information to help users with this disambiguate the term. The alternate and variant terms are indexed in databases, allowing users to find the appropriate resources, even if they do not know the authorized term. That is to say, even the end user only knows one of the variant terms and does not know the authorized term at all. They can still use that one variant as the search term and find every item that contains the authorized term. The third kind of controlled vocabulary is taxonomy. A taxonomy is a hierarchical classification or categorization system in which all the terms belong to one single hierarchical structure and have parent-child or broader, narrower relationships to other terms. In comparison to authority files, which have preferred terms and variant terms, a taxonomy also includes a hierarchy designating both broader and narrow terms. So in authority files, narrower and broader terms are more in a flat relationship, while in a taxonomy, they are in a tree structure. On the screen is an example from the National Center for Biotechnology Information Taxonomy. Notice that flamingo at the very top has 3 child terms, and they each have their own child terms as well. And each term can be traced back to their parent term, and all the most granular terms can be classified under flamingo, the very top parent term. All right. The fourth type of controlled vocabulary is the Thorus. The Thorus is a kind of dictionary, represents all the concepts for a specific domain in a consistent manner, and labels each concept with a preferred term. Like previously described examples of controlled vocabularies, the Thorus contain preferred terms, variant terms, broader and narrow terms. Additionally, the Thorus also includes related terms, which may or may not be part of the same hierarchical structure of the term. A commonly used thesaurus for describing art, architecture, and material cultural objects is the Getty Art and Architecture Thesaurus. I have an example from Getty AAT on the screen. In this example, I searched for monument, and I got the complete structure for all the broader and narrow terms for monument. On the left, that's the search results after I put in monument in the search box and hit the search button. And you also can click into each term to see the related terms. So on the right, I have clicked into markers monument, and it shows that markers monument is the preferred term, but there are other related terms listed. In this case, they are just in different language. Okay, now we know what the controlled vocabularies are. Let us get back to our earlier question, which was how the controlled vocabulary facilitate indexing and searching. Ideally, if a system is employing a controlled vocabulary, the vocabularies are indexed in the system. For example, libraries using Library of Congress authorities should have all the Library of Congress authority files indexed in the local library system. That way, all the variants of any preferred terms are captured and indexed and searchable. Of course, any established controlled vocabularies are supposed to have the characteristics of specificity and exhaustivity, which means that the authorized term is able to specifically describe one thing or one concept. Meanwhile, its variants have broad and deep enough of coverage in describing the same thing or the concept. That way, for the end user who performs searching, no matter what search term they might be able to come up with, it can be covered by the variants, if not the preferred term, and the user's search results exhaust the database. Their target item must be within the search results. That is to say, the users won't need to know all the possible variants of any term or the authorized term in order to find their target results. I want to also quickly cover controlled vocabulary and controlled format. Controlled vocabularies are organized sets of terminology values. Controlled format refers to the rules concerning the allowable data types and formatting of information. Controlled format can be applied to either a free text field or a field that's linked to a controlled vocabulary. Controlled format is often applied to date fields and is also suitable for measurements, geographic coordinates, or other fields where numbers or codes are used. I have a quick example here to show controlled vocabulary versus controlled format. The red box mark the controlled vocabularies, and the blue box mark the controlled format. Finally, I want to show a few quick examples of controlled vocabularies for certain fields. For creators, we often use Library of Congress name authority, virtual international authority file. For subjects, the Library of Congress subject heading is the most popular one. At least it's the most popular one in the North America. For locations, getty the Thorus of geographic names, and the geonames.org, and of course, Library of Congress geographic names. For rights, rightstatements.org and creativecommons.org are widely used. For type, it's DCMI types. It's recommended for digital objects. Library of Congress also provides genre terms as well. For format, internet media types is recommended for digital objects. So that's all I have for today. Thank you. Keila, please take it over.
Thank you, Xiying. And so I'm going to talk to you all today about some of the most common metadata elements for fields that you're going to be using when creating metadata for digital library materials. And I'm also going to be providing some examples of different content types and how these fields work within those different types of content and how you might be using those. So these are obviously not all of the fields that are available to use, but they do kind of go across different metadata schemas. So there are crosswalks for a lot of these between mods and Dublin Core, which we talked about in our previous webinar. They are the ones that get utilized the most by users and search interfaces for finding the content. So some of the names for these fields might differ a little bit across schemas, but the purpose of them is going to be the same. I didn't add mappings here for the purposes of this presentation, but you can explore some of the mappings in either the Library of Congress, which does have a mods to Dublin Core mapping, but we also have a mapping available in our metadata participation guidelines, which are linked at the end of this presentation as well. So first we're going to talk about title, and titles are perhaps like the most basic metadata field. Every single item that you create metadata for should have a title. But unlike cataloging a book or a DVD, sometimes the item doesn't have a given title, so you'll need to create one yourself. So when we're looking at creating a title, you want to try to make a title descriptive enough to give someone the essential information about what the item is or what it contains. So maybe sometimes the title that just has a few words isn't going to be descriptive enough, but you also don't want a title that's going to be multiple sentences and is basically a full description. So you want to kind of have something that's a little bit of a middle ground that has just enough information for someone to be able to evaluate the resource when they're looking at search results. So in this example, if you're looking at describing this photograph, we obviously don't want to include all the people's names in the description, in the title. That is more apt for a description field. But the title, that's kind of the middle ground, describes what's in the photo, where it is, and the year, which is something that information that someone might not be able to see in the search results, depending on the search interface. You might not be able to see all the location or the date fields. So this gives people a good understanding of what's there, when it took place, and where it is. If someone's looking for just this item, I'm sorry. So you want to, when you're creating your title, you want to think about how it's going to be interpreted outside of your repository as well as inside of your repository, and for users who are not necessarily familiar with the materials in your collections. So if someone is in your repository and they're looking at only the items from this collection, they might already know that this is in Idaho. But if they encounter this in search results in your library catalog, for example, they might not have that information. So you want to make sure that you include just enough information that is going to be useful outside of its context. So next is description. So a description obviously is a description. So you can include much more information in a description. And here you can include like a list of names if you know who everyone is in a photo. Sometimes we don't always have the luxury of knowing who everyone is in a photo, so that might not be some information that you can include. But it does give you the opportunity to tell the story of the item in more depth, rather than just in what you would put in a title. This is another example of a description. So in pretty much every single metadata schema, this is going to be a free text field. So you can pretty much do a lot with this field. It can be a very versatile field to use. So, but at the same time, you want to make sure that you are using the other fields appropriately as they're designed. So you want to avoid making the description field like a junk drawer for other information. There are going to be notes fields that you can use that for. Sometimes your system might even let you customize notes fields with labels or hide notes fields. Very often a description is going to be public. So you want to make sure that you're using it for information that's going to be relevant to your users. So here we've given researchers the ability to search for specific people in this photo. So if somebody's doing research, for example, on Bobby Nance, this photo would come up in their search. So it's really important to think about what things a user might search for if you want this item to show up in their results. But again, I understand that we don't always have the luxury of knowing who everyone is in the photo. So simply describing what's in the photo might be enough. And if you have no information about the photo, sometimes you don't need a description, and a title is sufficient with kind of that brief description that we talked about in the previous item. So the description field is also a good opportunity to provide additional context for the item. That's not necessarily something we're trained to do all the time, adding context to our materials, but it is really important to do that sometimes when you're thinking about where this metadata might be showing, right? So like they might not always find this information directly related with the photo or in context with the other items in that curated collection that you've created. So in this example, we've provided enough information to inform people that where this is and what it is, but it's also providing people with information that this was the main crop for this particular county where this photo was taken. So often when we're creating metadata, you can do a little bit of additional research about an item to learn more about it. And the description field is a really good place to include that information. But you also want to provide a balance, again, like with titles, and not provide too much information. So this isn't an encyclopedia entry, but it can help people understand the item a little bit more if you include a little bit of that contextual information. Which brings us to subject headings. So subject headings are another great way to either add context or include some keywords that you want to make sure are included in a record for people to be able to find them when they're searching for these items. You want to make sure that the search headings you're selecting are what the item is about, what the resource is about. So it helps group items together that are about similar things. It's really, really important to be consistent with the use of your subject headings. You can use a controlled vocabulary like Xiying talked about. The Library of Congress subject headings is one of the most common ones, but it's not always appropriate. Sometimes you can create your own local terms list, but as long as you're using it consistently, your system will allow that to be grouped together. So in this example, we have a album cover. So we've included subject headings for the artist, as well as her recording company, which is included on this album cover and in the production of the album. We've also included Singers, Cuba, which is a Library of Congress subject heading with a subdivision. And that allows us to group Cuban singers together in the same collection, or in the same repository rather. And we've also included salsa musicians, as that's the genre that she sung in. So you can also get singers who sing salsa that aren't necessarily Cuban. So sometimes applying subject headings can be a little bit difficult. It's hard to know what is the most important thing or what's important enough to warrant a subject heading, but you, similar to descriptions and titles, want to aim for kind of a middle ground because not everything that's represented in an item necessarily needs a subject heading. So again, think about your user's intent. When would you want this item to show up in a search for something? A good example of that I've experienced is an item that had 37 subject headings. It didn't need 37 subject headings, and many of them were not really relevant to the resource as a whole. It was an oral history, about an hour long. One of the subject headings was soup, but the primary purpose of the interview was to talk about the development of the Space Coast region. And soup isn't really a subject heading that would be relevant to someone who was looking for that information. But the person mentioned a diner that they liked to have lunch at. So you really do want to find a balance there and not necessarily include every keyword that someone might have said in an interview or that might be included in a resource. Excuse me. These are examples of some other common controlled vocabularies that you might reference. As I said, there are some limitations to some of these. So depending on what you're describing, you may also go outside of these common subject heading controlled vocabularies, or you can create your own as long as you are consistent. Okay, so date. As she mentioned earlier, dates are not a controlled vocabulary, but they are something you want to use controlled formats for. You want to make sure that you are including the date or the date range of the original resource here, and not like the date it was digitized or the date it was purchased or something like that. That's definitely something that you can include in your record. the date field is repeatable, but you probably want to hide that information from the public and not share that to other systems, as that won't be the intent of the user. They're not necessarily interested in when you digitize this, but when this object was created. You want to also ensure that you're avoiding additional punctuation, which is a common practice in cataloging, but it does make it so that the date is not necessarily machine readable and limits the ability to filter and sort by date for the resource. So the most common way to format your dates is the ISO standard 8601B, which is a 4-digit year, a 2-digit month, and a 2-digit day. And obviously, we don't always know the exact date for particular items. So if you don't have a month and a day, or it's not something that has a month day, it's just like an annual thing, you can include the year without the additional information. Or if you have the exact date, that's the second example there. And you can also include a date range. So something that I recommend when working with dates is, if you're unsure, but you have an idea of when something was created, a date range is better than a question mark or something like that. If you really have no idea when something was created, it's really best to leave this field empty rather than adding unknown or something like that. It will, again, make that field less machine readable. So this field can be left blank if you really just don't know. And again, date ranges will make it easier for users to be able to sort that rather than having additional information in there. Creator. So this field might have different names and different schemas, but it's going to be the person. This field is intended to describe the person or organization who is primarily responsible for creating the original resource. So there's going to be additional fields that you can have for contributors, and the mods schema does have terms that you can assign to denote what their role was. Dublin Core is a little more limited in that, but it does have a contributor field. It just doesn't let you label what their contribution was. But this is going to be the primary person. And again, this field is also repeatable. So if it's something with multiple authors, or you want to include an illustrator here, as well as the author of something like a children's book, this is a good place for that. And the Library of Congress does have authorities for this, as she mentioned earlier. A lot of published material that you're going to be using, or people who have published, are going to have Library of Congress authorities associated with them. And if they're not, if you have someone who can write authorities, that's something you can add to the Library of Congress database, or you can have just a local list for relevant creators for your collection. And you just want to make sure that you're including their information consistently. So last name, first name, middle initial or middle name, the year of birth and or death. If they are still alive, you just have the year and a dash and no end year. And if it's an organization, like you're like Marvel Comics Group, you just would include the name of the organization. The other thing I was going to mention about this is, what was I going to mention about this? And that's the main part of Creator. So that's going to be really useful for people to search. Oh, it was consistency. So sometimes you might be tempted to, if there isn't an authority, for example, to just have their last name and maybe a first initial instead of their last name and their first name. You want to make sure that you're consistent with the use of names, because your system will likely make it possible for people to sort by author, or like have a hyperlink that groups items together by the same person, or that include the same people. and you want to make sure that it's consistent so that resources aren't missed by the user. Okay, location is going to be another really important field and very common field. Not all resource types are going to require a location, but it is going to be really common for a lot of things. So again, for location, you want to make sure that this describes the locations covered by the specific item. This field might also be called place or geographic subject or coverage spatial depending on what schema you're using, but they all mean the same thing. We don't use this field to describe where the original object resides. So you don't want to put like the location of your organization here. It's going to be where the item takes place. So if it's a photo, where the photo was taken. If it's a book, the area that it covers. So like if it's a book about the Everglades, that's what you would want to put there. And again, really think about the user. The user isn't necessarily interested in where the item is held. That information can be included in a different field. They're probably more interested in where the item, what the subject of the item is. And as Xiying mentioned, you can use the getting thesaurus of geographic names, geonames. You can also use coordinates in this field if your system can convert those. Coordinates can often be useful for creating maps or virtual tours or things like that outside of your system. So including coordinates might be, if you have them, another good thing to include in this field to be even more specific. So this is an example of an item that you might be tempted to include a location that isn't necessarily what the user is looking for. The original item is from the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. That's the holding institution. The book was published in New York, but the book is about Baltimore, Maryland. So for the location, you would want to include Baltimore, Maryland, because that is the subject of the book, rather than the other locations, which can be included in different fields. So usually you would include New York, the location of publication with the publisher's information. Okay, and then the rates field. This is something that I think sometimes people don't always think about when they're creating their metadata, but this is really helpful to users to help them understand what they can and can't do with an item. So whenever possible, you want to avoid using a blanket statement for all of the items in your collections, like please contact us about rights information, because that isn't going to tell the user any information about that particular item. And it's going to create more work for you as well if people are contacting you every time they want to know information about the object. It's also important to be accurate in this field. So you don't want to necessarily claim copyright when your institution doesn't own the copyright of an item. And this is really common. It happens a lot in digital repositories. Just the act of digitizing something and putting it online doesn't make the copyright yours. It doesn't make your organization the copyright holder. And it's misleading. So ideally, you want to use a standard statement of your control vocabulary. And as she mentioned, the most common ones are rightstatements.org and Creative Commons. Rightstatements.org is going to be a statement that is specifically about the copyright information of that object. And then Creative Commons is going to be a license, which gives users certain permissions granted by the copyright holder. Keep in mind that Creative Commons licenses can only be issued by the copyright holder and not by your library if you don't own the copyright. But a lot of items these days will have Creative Commons licenses attached to them. This field can be one of the more challenging ones to complete. Copyright analysis can be time-consuming and tricky and complicated, especially if you have a lot of orphan works in your collection or aren't sure where the original owner of the item is. But rightstudents.org is a good place to start for resources. We're also happy at the Sunshine Digital Network to talk to you about copyright assessment and provide any resources related to copyright assessment for your collections. So type is another one of the most common fields you're going to be using. Type can mean different things, and it's very, very often used in different ways. So the way that we're using it here today is the type is the thing that describes the resource very broadly. So is this an image? Is this text? Is this a sound recording or a video? It's usually used for grouping items together. And used in filtering a lot. So if a user just wants images in their search, this is the field that gets used for that. The most common vocabulary types used in digital collections for this are the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative type vocabulary and the MODS type of resource vocabulary. They're pretty similar, but do have some slight differences. So if you're not sure which one you're using, just make sure that you pick one and stick to it instead of alternating between the two. This is also an element where it's really important to think about how users will understand your materials. So for example, when you scan the page of a book, technically you now do have an image. It's a TIFF probably, but the user isn't going to be thinking of that as an image. They're going to be thinking that primarily as text. So you want to make sure that you're including text in that field, as that's what the user is going to be looking for. So, and this is where it can be a little tricky. So the other field that is really similar to this is either going to be called genre, format, or medium. And a lot of people, I think that this is the same thing as type, but this is going to be more granular than type. So again, type is a broad grouping of things. This is going to be where you're going to be able to add more specific things. So in this example here, we have a newsletter. So our type would be text and our genre would be newsletters. Some common control vocabularies for this field would be the Getty Art and Architecture Thesaurus, the Thorus for graphic materials, and the Library of Congress also has format and genre types as vocabularies as well. So that's where you're going to find the more granular terms for this field to allow users to understand the full context of the item. Because it can be really difficult otherwise in a digital format to really fully convey to your users what they're looking at. So language is another one that, again, isn't going to be relevant to every single resource. You really want to use this field only for materials that have a strong language component. So for example, you don't want to include a language on a photograph because unless it has writing on it, it doesn't have any language associated with it. And again, this field, you want to make sure that it's the language of the object itself and not the language that the metadata is written in. A lot of times English gets assigned to materials that are not actually in English, and you want to avoid that confusion with your users. Another common thing that I see, you can leave this field blank. Don't feel bad leaving things blank. Again, most systems will only require you to have a title, so don't worry about leaving things blank. People will often fill this with unknown or UNK, and UNK is actually a language code for an obscure language. And so a lot of resources are getting associated with that particular language code, and they're not actually in that language. So you want to make sure that if there's nothing associated with it, or you're not sure which language it is, that you just leave this item blank. ISO 6393 is the standard that gets used most in this field, and it has 3-letter codes for languages, but it also has the full language name. So you can choose which one you'd like to include in your metadata. I think that the full language name is probably the most useful for your users, but either one will work. Okay, so we talked a little bit about in some of these fields, you might not have the full information for some of them, or you know, they came from an unknown source. The libraries had them for a long time and you don't necessarily have documentation associated with them. So some ways that you can find information to fill in these fields and have the most complete records possible is to use captions, or things written on the back of photos, using cues from the photo itself for dates and things like that. So you might be able to narrow down a date range if you're looking at photo cues like the clothing that they're wearing, the architecture that's behind them, whether or not a building that is supposed to be there isn't is there, the particular place that they're standing. You might be familiar with it. I have heard of a librarian using hotel reviews on TripAdvisor from a particular hotel with views outside the window to be able to identify a place. So there are resources out there to help you identify additional information that might not necessarily be included with the item. It's not always feasible to do that additional research. We have limited staff and limited time, so it's not a necessity, but it can, if you do have the ability to do that, it can be very, it can change the way users interact with your collection significantly. The more complete your records are and the more information you can provide for your resources, the easier it's going to be for your users to find what they're looking for and to use your collections. So we want to make sure we can do what we can within our capacity to make sure that we can help them do that. And yeah, so that's another way to find, and if you do have donor information or deeds of gift, sometimes that's also another good place to look for additional information about the materials. And if the person is still alive or they have family alive, that's another resource that you can tap into for making sure that you have the most information possible for your users in your metadata. So these are some questions to consider when you're creating your metadata. So what are users going to be searching for? What will help users find similar items? What will make good browsing experiences for your users? So again, not all the fields are necessarily going to show up in search results. So including something like a date range or a location in a title can be useful to users. And how can we honestly and respectfully represent the item? So again, thinking back to Library of Congress subject headings, they're not necessarily very good for describing Native American materials. They kind of lack in that area. So what kind of control vocabularies can we use that might be more appropriate or things like that, that reflect the material better? So thinking about those questions when you sit down to write your documentation for your metadata creation for that project and to actually create the metadata for your users. So now that we're thinking about those questions, we're going to talk a little bit about different content types and things to consider when looking at different types of material. So we're going to start with published material because that's a little bit easier. So books are a common item that you're going to find in digital collections. They can be a little bit easier to create metadata for because they very often come with like an OCLC record or something like that, or a MARC record that you can convert into a digital library record. And they're going to have information like the publication location. You also have the full context of the item right in front of you, right? Because you have the content of the book to help you write a description if there isn't an existing record. The things you want to make sure that you include when you're writing a record for a book is the title, any contributors. So here we have the creator under names, which is the mods field where you would include a contributor or a creator. The type of resource, which again is going to be text. The genre here is ebook. I probably would have used book because that's the original format of the book rather than the digital surrogate. But whatever works best for you and your users is up to your discretion. So if you want to use that, but I would recommend always erring on the side of describing the original rather than the digital surrogate. The records I'm going to show you here are not perfect. And your records are never going to be perfect, and I don't think we should strive for that. I think what we should strive for is the most complete we can get within our resources and with the information that we have. So just keep that in mind too. These are just recommendations, and your metadata is never going to be perfect, and we shouldn't try to make it that way. But yeah, so this is a good example of the proper use of the language field as well. So this book is not in English, it's in Yiddish. This will allow us to find other materials that are also in this language, which we can also see here reflected in the subject field. Okay, so newspapers and serials are going to have a lot of similarities because they are things that are produced in a series, right? And thinking about how to describe a top level serial versus an issue level will also depend again on the resources that you have available to you. So generally, when you're looking at a top level serial, obviously you're going to include the title and have a description of what that is, generally location, but also including the number of issues, especially if it's something that's no longer produced. It's useful for the user to understand how many of these were published, and also including the full date range. That'll help users narrow down the information that they might be able to find there, especially if your system doesn't allow for full text searching. So I'm going to show you an example of two examples actually of serials and how you can do this. Hopefully this loads. I thought the record was a little bit too big to include as a screenshot. So this is an example of a record that has a top level record here. So we have the title of the publication, as well as several alternate titles that users might search for that this journal was published under. The type of resource is text, its genre is journal. It also has the frequency of publication, which can be useful for users as well, where this was published and by whom, and a description of the journal in general, along with several different types of subject headings that will connect users to similar materials. But then when we look at the issue, you can add more information here. So you can include the table of contents here, which can be really helpful to users who are looking for specific work, or who have, if the table of contents has really descriptive titles, it can help them find particular subjects. You can also add or remove particular subject headings depending on if it's a special issue. And it covers a wider or a more tight group of subjects in that particular issue. But describing it at an issue level really gives you the opportunity to add more context and help users find that without necessarily having full text searching available to them. And then this other example is for a publication that didn't necessarily include like a table of contents or anything like that, but it does have the full date range of when this was published and how many issues are included in this run for this publication. And it also includes a link to all of the issues of this publication. So depending on how your system is structured, you may or may not be able to link them, but it can be really useful to connect them together if you can. Okay. And then newspaper articles and clippings, those can be quite different from having a full issue. Sometimes you don't necessarily have the name of the newspaper that it was published in or the date. Other times someone may have written that down on the back or something like that, or if it's in a scrapbook, they might have written it next to it. So a newspaper clipping can be a little bit more difficult to write about, but you can be more descriptive about what the content of the clipping is. So here we have an example of a newspaper clipping that we do have a date for. Oops, sorry. We do have a date for. We know which newspaper it was in, and the title of the particular article, which can be more useful than having just the title of the newspaper. And we also have a standardized right statement here, which is useful to the user to understand how they can access and reuse that information, or reuse the clipping. Maps are another form of published material that you'll probably have a lot of information to include in your record. This record is very thorough related to the map that it's describing. It includes even the measurements of the map. It also has a language because the map labels can be in different languages. In Florida, I know we have a lot of maps that are written in Spanish. So while the content of the resource is primarily as an image, it does have a strong language component associated with it. So this is an example of an image where you would want to include a language as well, especially if you have maps that might be in more than one language. And photographs. So now we're delving into material that may or may not be published. And so these are going to be the things that you might have to do a little bit of additional research on, or that you're going to have to do some work to create a title and description that won't necessarily have one associated with them already. So again, this is a very thorough record. This was a photograph of a real estate listing. So they have the full address of where this was taken. They've also included coordinates here, which again, if your system allows, it's really useful information if you have that available to you. It can be used in other ways outside of your system. But in addition to having the address, they've also included a description of the photo. So if you don't necessarily know who's in the photo or anything like that, just having like a broad description of what's happening in the photograph or what the photograph is depicting can be really useful for search results and for that item showing up in users' searches, because it'll have more keywords that the system can touch on. Additionally, this does also have a language associated with it, probably because it does have real estate information on the back of it. But generally for photograph, you probably aren't going to have a language component associated with that. And then here again, we have type. They've included image and text because it does have text on the back. And they've also included other information to connect this to the collections that it's associated with. So correspondence is going to be interesting, especially when it comes to postcards. So postcards can be a little tricky because sometimes they don't have writing on them, and in which case they wouldn't be considered correspondence. You would want to treat that more like an image. Also thinking about correspondence and copyright. is going to be an interesting question because the copyright owner is going to be the person who wrote the letter, not the person who received the letter. And generally, people will donate correspondence that they've received, not that they have written. So keeping that in mind when you're doing copyright assessment for letters and postcards. Postcards will also have the additional layer of copyright for the image that's on the postcard, in addition to whatever may be written on it. So that's also something to consider there. But here, the description is very simple. It just says who wrote the letter or who wrote the postcard, and generally what the topic of the postcard was. So it doesn't have to be a super stringent description, but if it doesn't have actual writing on it, you could just describe what the postcard is depicting. We also have postcard measurements. We have the language that it's written in, and we have relevant subject headings. So this postcard depicted the cathedral in Paris. And so we've included cathedrals as well as rivers because it does depict the Seine River in Paris. AV material, this could be either analog or in digital AV material, which is becoming more common. Here, under format, we've got the extent of the item, which includes the length, the file format that it's in, and additionally, there's a transcript included with this item. This is a field that you could repeat so that these items aren't all stacked in one field. So make sure that you're also unstacking fields when possible if your system allows you for you to repeat fields. And yeah, so again, we've got subject headings, we've got a creation date, we have a publisher for this, and we have the creator, which does include the interviewer and the interviewee, as they're both integral to the oral history that's being described here. If you wanted to, you could also denote their roles. If you're using mods, you can do that, but Dublin Core won't let you do that. So sometimes they are going to be in the same field and you won't know which is which, but you can clarify that in the description, which has been done here. And then we have type audio, and genre is interviews, because you could have lots of different audios. You could have music or something like that. And so you want to differentiate that in genre, again, because that's going to be the more specific field. And we have about a minute for questions. I did want to talk about scrapbooks. I'll just leave this field up. Scrapbooks are complicated. I didn't include an example here because scrapbooks can be done in many, many different ways, but these are some approaches that you can take to scrapbooks. Again, you want to consider what your capacity is and keep your users in mind and how you intend for them to search for stuff. But scrapbooks include everything, so they can be really difficult to describe, and just make sure you document your decisions for how you're going to be describing that type of resource. And does anyone have any questions about any of those things? You can feel free to place those in the chat. And while you're thinking of those questions, if you would not mind answering our short poll related to the training, we would greatly appreciate any feedback that you have. And also, please feel free to email either myself or Xiying if you have any questions. We're always happy to consult with you or answer any questions that you might have.